My name is Liza Caldwell. I'm 35 years old. And this is the story of how the man I trusted with everything tried to erase me, but I landed first and left him with nothing. The wind was brutal that day. I remember how it cut through my coat like a knife, how the rain stung my cheeks like slaps from a storm that knew too much. I was standing on the edge of the runway, heels sinking into a shallow puddle, watching a private jet roar into the sky, carrying my husband and the woman in the red dress who used to work under him. Now she was flying beside him. Laughing. As if I didn't exist. As if I hadn't been the one who built the life they were about to steal. Nathan didn't wave goodbye. He barely looked at me, and when he did, his eyes passed right through me. Like I was some stranded traveler caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I didn't chase the plane. I didn't scream. I just stood there, watching the jet disappear into the thick gray clouds, and slowly reached into my coat pocket. My fingers were numb, but steady. I pulled out my phone and typed with quiet precision. Book a private charter to Singapore. Departure, earliest possible. This wasn't spontaneous. It didn't start today. It started months ago, when I signed over 25% of my father's company to Nathan. The man I married. The man I believed had carried me through my darkest hour. Back then, he made me feel safe. The world was falling apart after Dad passed, the hospital lights had barely faded from memory when I was thrust into meetings, balance sheets, vendor disputes. But Nathan? He stood by me like a rock. He brought me tea at midnight. Took calls for me. Held me when I cried. And when I gave him a quarter of Eastwood noodles, I thought I was thanking him. Rewarding his loyalty. I was wrong. So terribly wrong. That night, after the jet vanished, an employee rushed out to the tarmac holding an umbrella. "Miss Liza, the storm's picking up," he said softly, like I was breakable. But I wasn't. Not anymore. Inside the lounge, I thawed beside a heater, listening to the rain lash against the windows. I pulled out a worn leather notebook from my bag, my father's old journal. He was methodical in everything. Recipes, supplier lists, contingency plans. On the back page, in my own handwriting, I had once scribbled a line he told me the year before he died. "If someone ever tries to steal the family name, don't scream. Take it back quietly, thoroughly, and without mercy." I opened the notebook and added a new line under it. "The jet that left today carried thieves. But I hold the deed to everything." I stared at those words. Then closed the notebook. That plane belonged to my father. That company bore his name. And if they thought they could lock me out of it all, they hadn't read the playbook I wrote while they were celebrating. 6 months ago, I stood in an ICU room, holding the hand of the only person who truly believed I could lead. My father built Eastwood noodles out of a rented strip mall kitchen in Sacramento. He used to joke that he made soup before he could spell success. But there was nothing funny about watching him fade away. That flatline sound still haunts me. It felt like the end of a story. But I now know it was just the end of Act 1. Nathan had been incredible during that time, or so I thought. He booked hotel rooms, shielded me from reporters, even answered texts from suppliers while I was picking out funeral flowers. "Don't worry about anything," he'd say, brushing my hair back, tucking me into bed like I was some fragile doll. "Just rest." I believed him. Why wouldn't I? We'd been married 8 years. I trusted him with my grief, my future, and then, 1 week after the funeral, my father's lawyer arrived with the will. "Liza, your father left all shares to you. Every single one. No trustees. No backup heirs. Just you." I nodded. I already knew. Dad had told me that last summer. He said a family business needs a keeper of the flame, not a chaser of power. What I didn't know was how quickly Nathan would try to become that chaser. At first, it was subtle. Nathan never demanded control. He offered help. Little suggestions. Quiet support. He'd stay up late with me running the numbers, suggesting vendors, pitching ideas. He said he was happy to be in the background. But when his 40th birthday rolled around, I gave him a gift. Not just a vintage watch or a rare bottle of wine, though I gave those too. No, I gave him a leather envelope. Inside was the signed transfer of 25% ownership in Eastwood Noodles. You held me through my worst, I said as I handed it to him. Now let me show you, I remember. He hugged me so tightly I thought I'd never regret it. But 3 months later, I wasn't being CC'd on financial decisions. I was being bypassed in emails. A new marketing director, Vanessa Powell, showed up, unannounced and unqualified, and suddenly I wasn't in charge anymore. Not really. Still, I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I started gathering. Watching. Recording. The more I dug, the more I saw the truth. Offshore transfers. Contracts under shell companies. Even his travel plans weren't real. He said he was in Chicago. He was in Palm Springs, with Vanessa. When I laid the hotel invoice on the table, he didn't even deny it properly. Just mumbled about one-time mistakes and miscommunication. That was the night I stopped sleeping in our bedroom. That was the night Scarlett Caldwell died, and Liza Eastwood was reborn. I stopped reacting and started preparing. I reached out to Vivian Tran, an old college friend turned financial attorney. Sent her everything. Every file. Every shred of data I had collected. I told her I wasn't trying to save a marriage. I was reclaiming a kingdom. The next morning, she called me after reading the documents. Her voice was like steel wrapped in silk. Liza, she said, this isn't a corporate disagreement. It's structured betrayal. And if they're flying you overseas to sign a resignation, it's fraud. I looked out at the jet streaking across the sky. That betrayal was in motion, but so was I. Because they thought I'd be asleep on that flight while they finalized everything. What they didn't know was that I'd already filed the injunction. Already had a folder full of evidence. Already had the court's attention. They flew out thinking they were executing a clean takeover. But I landed first. And by the time that plane touched down in Singapore, there'd be nothing left for them to take. The flight I booked to Singapore wasn't luxurious. No private jet, no champagne, no leather seats. Just a quiet business-class cabin on a commercial airline. But it carried something far more valuable than vanity, evidence, strategy, and resolve. While Nathan sipped bourbon in first class, probably thinking he had me cornered, I was already in the airspace of retaliation. I arrived in Singapore 12 hours before them. Checked into a different hotel. Used a different name. Vivian had already connected me to a local law firm, neutral ground where I could finalize the filings and hand-deliver copies to Eastwood's international partners before Nathan even cleared customs. I wasn't there to argue. I was there to present proof. I remember the face of Mr. Chandra, Seabright Ventures executive liaison. He blinked in disbelief as I laid the documents on the table, unauthorized transfers, hidden partnerships, offshore holdings under shell corporations tied to Nathan's alias. Then I showed him the signed emergency order from California Superior Court, halting all merger activities and freezing share transfers until a formal audit could be conducted. Mr. Chandra didn't say much. But when he looked up, his expression had changed. Mrs. Caldwell, he said slowly, respectfully, I believe this alters the context of tomorrow's board presentation. No, I said, calm and clear, this is the board presentation. That same day, I had the front desk scan and send notarized copies of my filings to the California Attorney General's office. Every email went through my private, encrypted domain. No loose ends. No one else had access. And every time my phone buzzed, my pulse stayed even. Because this wasn't a gamble. This was checkmate, already played, already confirmed. When Nathan and Vanessa landed, they did so thinking they had every upper hand. What they walked into was a silent storm of legal blockades, executive skepticism, and broken trust. I didn't attend the welcome dinner. Didn't need to. Instead, I met with Eastwood's Asia-Pacific team privately, the same team Vanessa was supposedly here to impress. I sat in a modest boardroom across from them, still in the suit my father had tailored for me 5 years ago. I asked them 3 simple questions. 1. Do you know the origin story of Eastwood Noodles? 2. Do you believe in what we stand for? 3. Do you trust someone who deletes the founder's name from every internal memo? They didn't answer right away. But one by one, I saw it in their faces: understanding, loyalty, a spark of shared memory. They didn't need a speech. Just permission to remember who we were. Meanwhile, Nathan was busy prepping for the big reveal, his perfect PowerPoint, his strategic rebrand, his plans for the new hierarchy. I could imagine him rehearsing it in the mirror, confident, charming, smug. And all the while, he had no idea that Seabright's executive board had already been briefed, not by rumor, not by speculation, but by me. The next morning, I walked into the hotel's conference center just as Nathan was being mic'd up for the presentation. His eyes locked on mine across the room, and for the first time in a long time, he looked nervous. I didn't nod. I didn't smile. I just took a seat in the second row and waited. He started strong, as expected. Talked about brand evolution, expansion, modernization. He dropped trendy buzzwords like agile transformation and market disruption. Vanessa stood off to the side, beaming, her red dress a little too vibrant under the conference lights. And then, 5 slides in, it hit a wall. A Seabright board member raised a hand. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "before we proceed, we've received a set of documents that raise serious questions about Eastwood's current leadership structure and pending merger terms." Nathan faltered. I wasn't made aware of any documentation submitted directly to Seabright. The board member raised a folder. "You are now." Silence swept the room. The next 30 minutes were a slow dissection of everything I had uncovered. Nathan's shell companies. Vanessa's unauthorized salary disbursements. Fraudulent branding invoices. All of it laid out with surgical precision. And I didn't have to say a word. The truth spoke for me. Nathan tried to recover, of course. Blamed clerical errors. Claimed I was reacting emotionally. He even had the audacity to suggest that I was struggling to separate grief from governance. That's when I stood up. Not to yell. Not to plead. But to correct the record. "I'm not grieving," I said, my voice ringing through the marble chamber. "I'm executing my responsibility to protect the legacy of the man who built this company from nothing. The man whose name you erased. And the man whose daughter you tried to replace." I turned to the board. "I have already filed an injunction in California. The court has suspended all structural changes pending a formal audit. And until that audit is complete, I remain the sole executive authority for Eastwood Noodles, by law." Nathan opened his mouth to argue, but Vanessa touched his arm. "No," she whispered. "She's right." And just like that, the illusion shattered. Later that evening, I received an email from the board, a formal vote to suspend all merger activity and restore my executive control, effective immediately. Nathan's power, the one I had handed him in an envelope out of trust, was gone. By the time they checked out of the hotel the next morning, Nathan and Vanessa didn't just look defeated, they looked hollow. But the most poetic part? They still had to fly home, economy class. Because the company jet? That was under my name again. And I took it back the same way they tried to take the company, quietly, legally, and without warning. As I sat in that leather seat, sipping a modest cup of tea, I opened my father's notebook again. His notes were faint, faded from years of use. But one quote stood out on the final page. "If someone shows you who they are, don't argue. Just never hand them the keys again. I landed in California 2 days later, quietly, without ceremony. No press, no welcome committee. Just me, my suitcase, and a hard black folder that had traveled halfway around the world without leaving my side. Inside it were the documents that saved my father's company, my dignity, and every ounce of power Nathan tried to steal. I didn't go home. I went straight to Eastwood headquarters. The office had changed in my absence. I could feel it in the air, colder, sleeker. Vanessa's influence was everywhere. New glass signage. Modernist gray accents. Even the faint scent of some corporate room spray I'd never approved. It was like they had tried to scrub me out while I was still alive. But as I stepped into the executive suite, the same one where I used to sit with my father, sleeves rolled up, a takeout bowl of pho in one hand and spreadsheets in the other, it was all still there. His framed photo. His battered coffee mug. A pen holder I'd made in high school that he refused to throw away. And behind the desk? My new assistant, Rita. She stood up quickly. Miss Caldwell, she paused, smiled nervously, then corrected herself, Mrs. Eastwood. Welcome back. I nodded, then handed her the black folder. Make 5 copies. Deliver 1 to legal, 1 to finance, and 1 to every board member's desk before noon. She took it without question. That afternoon, I called an emergency executive meeting. Half the leadership team looked like they'd seen a ghost when I walked into the boardroom. The other half looked relieved. I didn't slam my hand on the table. I didn't raise my voice. I simply opened the folder and began. For 3 months, we have been operating under the false assumption that Nathan Caldwell was a controlling partner in Eastwood Noodles. As of this morning, all evidence of fraud, manipulation, and asset misappropriation has been submitted to both internal and external investigators. Effective immediately, his access is revoked. A hush fell across the room. Furthermore, Vanessa Powell's appointment was not formally ratified by this board, nor was she vetted by HR. Her contract has been terminated. She is not to be granted access to any Eastwood property or server. One of the finance directors, a wiry man named Martin who'd always kept his nose in the numbers, leaned forward. So, you're saying Nathan's out? For good? I met his gaze. Not just out. Disqualified. There were murmurs. Some relief. Some guilt. But no one challenged me. Not anymore. That evening, security escorted Nathan from the building. He tried to argue. Claimed the injunction would be overturned. Threatened a lawsuit. I watched from behind the tinted glass wall of my father's office as he was led out, his once confident stride faltering. And just before the elevator doors closed, he looked up and saw me. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't shout. He just stared, hollow-eyed, as if realizing for the first time that I was never the emotional little girl he thought he could manipulate. I turned away before the doors closed. 2 hours later, I received an official confirmation from the court. Nathan's shares would be frozen pending divorce proceedings, and all voting rights would revert to the majority shareholder, me. That night, I walked through the building, alone. Room by room, I took stock. Not of property, not of assets, but of spirit. My father had built this place with heart, with grit, with the stubborn hope that food could tell a story. But somewhere along the line, we let buzzwords replace values. We let Nathan's smooth talking replace the rough hands that used to stir broth for 12 hours straight. I paused in the old test kitchen, the one Dad refused to renovate even after our 15th location opened. The tiles were cracked, the counters dented, but it still smelled faintly of ginger and lemongrass. And in the far drawer, I found it, the original spice ledger. Inside were his handwritten recipes. His corrections. His crossed-out ideas. His notes in the margins, things like too salty. Add star anise. Needs heat, try fermented chili next time. And in the top corner, Liza's version, keep testing. I sat down on the stool by the counter and wept, not because I was broken, but because I wasn't. I had survived. No, I had rebuilt. The next week, we launched a quiet internal initiative called Legacy 2. A return to our roots, not a rebrand, but a rebalance. We brought back original flavors. Rehired old staff that Nathan had quietly phased out. We created mentorship programs for second-generation Asian American chefs. And every label on our spice line bore a small seal with one phrase. Founded in fire. Reinvented with soul. Meanwhile, Nathan? His name disappeared from every official document within 72 hours. Word got out. His accounting firm pulled away. Seabright canceled their interest. Vanessa tried to spin a PR statement, but it fell flat. The internet isn't kind to cheaters, especially not corporate ones. And me? I didn't post anything. Didn't explain. I let the silence speak. Until one night, 2 weeks later, I received a letter. Handwritten. No return address. Inside was a single sentence. I never thought you'd be the one to ruin me. I folded the paper neatly, placed it in my drawer beside my father's old notes, and whispered aloud. You did that all by yourself. Divorcing Nathan wasn't about heartbreak. It wasn't even about closure. It was about removal. Extraction. Clearing cancer from the system before it spread any further. And like most surgeries, it was meticulous, painful, and absolute. Vivian handled most of it. She was ruthless in the best way. Every hidden account Nathan had tried to bury under shell companies was dragged into the light. Every personal expense disguised as business development was exposed. The spa trips. The luxury hotel suites. The 5-figure consulting fees funneled to Vanessa through a fake PR firm. All of it, lined up, documented, frozen. I didn't argue with him. Didn't take his calls. I let the silence grow so loud he had to scream into it. And when he finally did, 1 panicked voicemail, then 2, then 5 in a single evening, I sat in my living room with the lights off, letting his voice echo off the walls. Liza, please. You don't understand what this is doing to me. I made mistakes, but I loved you. I still love you. I didn't want it to happen this way. Please don't let the lawyers decide everything. We can talk. But it was already too late. He hadn't just cheated. He'd orchestrated my erasure. Tried to steal my name. My father's name. And for that, there was no negotiation. The divorce was finalized in 8 weeks. We had a prenup. Ironclad. Nathan got nothing but his clothes, his car, and the reality of starting over without reputation or title. His 25% of Eastwood Noodles? Absorbed back into the company under breach of fiduciary duty. The day the papers were finalized, Rita brought a bottle of champagne into my office. She hesitated before setting it down. Congratulations. I think, she said, with a nervous smile. I didn't pop it open. I just looked out the window toward the city skyline and whispered, not yet. We're not done. Because I hadn't come this far just to return to the status quo. I was going to build something new, something beyond what even my father had dreamed of. That weekend, I flew to Sacramento. Alone. I hadn't been back to the original Eastwood shop since the funeral. It was still there, tucked between a laundromat and an old VHS rental store turned vape shop. The paint was peeling. The neon sign flickered. But the smell, ginger, scallion, star anise, still lingered like an echo of everything we'd built. I didn't go inside. I just stood across the street and watched through the window as the new owner ladled broth into white ceramic bowls, smiling with a hum in his chest. He had no idea the woman watching used to clean those very tables as a teenager. And that's when I felt it. Peace. I didn't need to reclaim the old place. I needed to honor it by pushing forward. When I returned to headquarters Monday morning, I made the announcement: Eastwood Noodles would launch a non-profit culinary school for immigrant families, focusing on preserving traditional recipes while helping newcomers build sustainable food businesses. No PR stunt. No vanity project. Just real legacy. I called it the Spoon and Flame Initiative. Our first class launched in San Jose with 12 students, mothers, grandfathers, former line cooks, teenage daughters who'd grown up watching their parents cook over one-burner stoves. I taught the first course myself. Tell me what memory your food holds, I asked them. If it doesn't have one, it's not ready. Their answers made me cry. One man talked about the fish stew his grandmother used to make during war. A woman remembered baking with her mother after surviving the refugee camps. A teenager spoke about dumplings folded by candlelight when the power was out in winter. And I knew then, Eastwood wasn't just noodles anymore. It was soul food in the truest sense. Meanwhile, Nathan? He tried to sue. Of course he did. A desperate Hail Mary filed under wrongful dismissal, character defamation, and emotional distress. But he'd underestimated two things: 1, the court of law, and 2, the court of public opinion. Because while his suit was quietly tossed out by a judge citing evidence of misconduct too substantial to ignore, the media had a field day with it. One headline read, "Man sues ex-wife after failing to steal her empire, receipts say otherwise." Another? "The Mistress, the merger, and the millionaire who lost everything." Nathan disappeared from the business circuit. Last I heard, he moved to Arizona and started working at a mid-level firm as a consultant. No photos. No press. Just a LinkedIn profile with suspicious gaps in his employment history. And Vanessa? She tried to pivot as a social media strategist, but her attempts at personal brand healing fell flat. Apparently, being the face of Betrayal doesn't translate into sponsored skincare deals. I never gloated. I never responded. But one day, a package arrived at Eastwood HQ. No return label. Inside? A red dress, neatly folded. The same one Vanessa wore on the tarmac the day they left me behind. There was no note. Just the fabric, still smelling faintly of her perfume. Rita was horrified. "Should we report it?" I shook my head. "No," I said. "Just put it in storage." "Why?" "Because one day, I want to show my daughter what betrayal looks like when it knows it's lost." Rita blinked. "You don't have a daughter." I smiled. "Not yet. But I would. And she'd know this story. All of it. Because it wasn't just a story about revenge. It was about legacy. And making sure no one ever tried to erase ours again. 3 months passed. Quiet ones. Focused ones. Not peaceful exactly. I don't think peace comes easily after betrayal that deep, but something better: control. Eastwood Noodles was no longer just a business. It was a restoration project, an evolution. I spent my mornings in meetings and my nights back in the test kitchen, refining recipes and reviewing grant proposals for the Spoon and Flame Initiative. We were expanding, fast. A second school opened in Oakland. Then a third in Fresno. For every class, I made it a point to stop by at least once, just to remind myself of why we were doing it. But for all the public victories, there were moments behind closed doors when the silence still hurt. Like the anniversary of my father's death. Or the first day I had to walk past the spot where Nathan and I had shared morning coffee for 5 years straight. I'd stare at that empty chair and wonder, was any of it ever real? And then I'd remember his voice in that recording I'd saved. "Once I have majority control, the divorce will be clean and quick." Yeah. It was real. Real enough to never forget. One morning, as I stepped off the elevator onto the executive floor, Rita rushed toward me, phone in hand and eyebrows pinched tight. "Liza, you need to see this." She handed me her screen. A blog post. A scandal. Apparently, Nathan had tried to launch a food tech startup with an old college friend. Disruption meets delivery, the tagline read. But less than a week into launch, an exposé surfaced. The business model was plagiarized from a proposal submitted by a young entrepreneur named Javier Ng, a Filipino immigrant whose project had been rejected by the same VC firm that later backed Nathan's copycat. Emails were leaked. Investors pulled out. By lunchtime, the site was offline. I leaned back in my chair, reading the comments piling up under a tweet that said, "Once a thief." But I didn't share it. Didn't like it. Didn't join the digital bonfire. It wasn't my fire to light. That wasn't the game anymore. Later that day, Javier himself sent me a LinkedIn message. "Ms. Eastwood, I've followed your journey for years. Just wanted to say thank you. Watching how you handled what you went through gave me the strength to speak up. I thought people like him always win. You showed me that sometimes, we do." I stared at that message for a long time. Then I invited him to visit our Oakland campus. We sat together in the test kitchen, him telling me about his father's garlic rice recipe and the food truck he'd helped run through high school. We hired him on the spot as a part-time instructor and research chef. That's when it hit me, this was the legacy. Not the headlines. Not the court wins. It was the next generation finally having a shot, not in spite of people like Nathan, but because we took them down when it mattered. The next week, I met with the Eastwood board and proposed something radical. "I want to create a founders fund," I said, standing in front of a projection that read the Liza P. Eastwood Trust. "It'll offer no-interest microloans to family-owned restaurants. Immigrant-owned. BIPOC-owned. Female-owned. Anyone who reminds me of where we started." The room was silent. Not in disagreement, in surprise. Then Martin from finance, the same man who'd once followed Nathan like a shadow, raised a hand. "Why now?" I didn't flinch. Because I was almost erased. And I swore no one else under this name would ever be. The motion passed unanimously. We kicked it off with a pilot round, 25 small restaurants from across California. I met every single one of them. Ate in their kitchens. Laughed with their families. I remembered every detail. But there was one I wouldn't forget. A woman named Mai. 63 years old. Came from Vietnam in the early 80s. Ran a tiny pho stall out of a gas station on Stockton Avenue. When I told her we'd be covering her next expansion, she didn't hug me. She held my hands and said, "Your father helped me once. He told me I made broth like I'd lived the story. Now you're doing the same." I didn't cry until I got back in the car. Legacy. That word echoed again. It wasn't about fame. Or forgiveness. Or revenge. It was about restoring what was almost taken and multiplying it in the lives of others. But not everyone was content to fade into the background. One cold morning in December, Rita buzzed my office. "There's someone in reception asking to see you." "Who is it?" She hesitated. "It's Vanessa." I froze. Not out of fear. Out of disbelief. I hadn't seen her in person since that day on the runway, when she walked toward the jet beside Nathan in a red jumpsuit like she belonged there. And now she was back? "Should I call security?" Rita asked. "No. Let her in." Vanessa stepped in slowly, dressed far less confidently than the last time. No red. No gloss. Just a muted gray coat and eyes that looked like they hadn't slept. "Liza," she said, voice cautious. "I know I don't deserve to be here. But I need to say something." I gestured to the chair. She sat, clutching a small envelope. "I've lost everything. The contracts. The reputation. My name's blacklisted. And I know I earned that. I said nothing. She pushed the envelope across the desk. It's not money. I know better. It's a letter I found in Nathan's drawer the night before we left for Singapore. It was addressed to you. But he never gave it to you. I picked up the envelope. My part in all of it, she added, was real. I don't expect forgiveness. I didn't want to carry this anymore. She left without another word. I opened the letter hours later. Nathan's handwriting. Sharp, clean, arrogant. Liza. You were never meant to be small. That was my mistake. I tried to manage you instead of stand beside you. I thought I was building a new empire, but I was just tearing down someone else's. If you're reading this, I guess I failed at both. I folded it neatly, placed it beside the red dress in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. Not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder. Even when they think they've won, some men build empires from stolen bricks, and when you take back the foundation, all they're left with is dust. The year rolled into spring, and Eastwood Noodles was thriving, but not just as a business. We had become something else. Something wider. Deeper. More than the smell of simmering broth in test kitchens, more than the spreadsheets or the board votes. We had become a movement of restoration, of memory, of rightful ownership. And yet, I found myself walking slower each morning as I passed the wall of old framed headlines near the elevator. Most were about my father. Others about our first locations. A few, more recent, about me. But there was one space still empty. A frame that had never been filled since the day we took down Nathan's fraudulent marketing campaign, the one that rebranded us as Eastwood 2.0, stripping away every trace of tradition in favor of sterile modernism. That empty frame stayed as a reminder, some things don't deserve a picture. But now, it felt like time. I called Rita into my office one afternoon and handed her a photo, a snapshot from the first class of Spoon and Flame's Oakland campus. 12 students standing proudly in front of their dishes, smiling with the kind of warmth you can't fake. In the middle was Javier, his apron covered in flour, holding up a tray of dumplings. "Print this," I said. "Put it in that frame." She smiled. "It's finally time, huh?" "Yes. We don't need to hide the gap anymore. We've filled it." But life, as it always does, has a sense of timing you can't script. That evening, just as I was packing my bag, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Local. I almost ignored it, but something told me to answer. "Liza Eastwood," I said. There was silence. Then a voice I hadn't heard in nearly a year. "Hi. It's Nathan." I froze, not in shock, but in instinct. "I'm not interested in any kind of." "I'm not calling for that," he interrupted. I wanted to tell you I'm leaving California." Silence again. As if he expected a reaction. "Good," I said simply. "I got an offer from a firm in New Mexico. Nothing glamorous. But it's work." More silence. "I know you don't owe me anything. And I'm not asking for forgiveness." But I needed to say it out loud. I lost everything. And for the first time, I understand why. I didn't answer. I didn't owe him comfort. But I stayed on the line a moment longer. "I'm not the man I was," he said quietly. I almost told him that was the first true thing he'd said in years. But instead, I spoke the words I had rehearsed in my mind 100 times, yet never imagined I'd say so calmly. "You didn't break me, Nathan. You bent me. And I reshaped myself around the break." He let out a shaky breath. "Goodbye, Liza." And that was it. No drama. No apology that could erase anything. Just a man walking away from the ashes of something he thought he controlled. I stared at my phone for a long time before placing it face down on the desk. The next morning, I arrived early at HQ and walked into the test kitchen before anyone else. The old tiles still cracked in the corners. The smell of star anise still faint in the walls. The room was still mine, even after everything. I lit the stove and pulled out the recipe book again, my father's, worn and annotated, a legacy in pages. But this time, I opened to a blank one. A new section. No title yet. No rules. Just space. Because I wasn't just keeping the flame anymore. I was building the next fire. At noon, Rita stepped in with a clipboard. "We've got media coming tomorrow. Forbes wants to do a feature. Something about Eastwood's rise from corporate sabotage to cultural renaissance." I laughed. "Sounds dramatic." "You earned it." She hesitated, then added, "Also, someone dropped something off for you." "No name. Just this." She handed me a small, rectangular box. I opened it slowly. Inside was a ceramic soup spoon, handmade, glazed in the softest jade green. Etched into the handle were 3 simple words. "You held on." No note. No explanation. But I didn't need one. I placed it in the glass display by the door, next to the original ladle my father used in 1984 when he opened the first location. 2 tools. 2 eras. 1 story. Mine. Later that week, I gave a speech at a university event on women in leadership. They introduced me as the CEO of a multi-million-dollar culinary empire, a cultural ambassador, a survivor of corporate betrayal. I smiled as I stepped up to the microphone. "Titles come and go," I began. "But what matters is this: when someone tries to reduce you to a line item in their plan, remind them that you are the page they're writing on." Applause. But even as I left the stage, shaking hands and smiling for photos, I was already thinking about what was next. A new line of sauces, inspired by the recipes our students brought from Cambodia, Ghana, Mexico, Iran. A foundation scholarship for daughters of small business owners. A storytelling archive to capture immigrant food legacies before they were forgotten. This wasn't just a company anymore. It was a home built brick by brick on the backs of those who refused to disappear. People like me. Like my father. And like the 12 students in that first spoon and flame photo, now framed in the lobby like a promise kept. I stood by it that evening, long after the office had cleared out. The cleaning crew passed quietly, nodding as they swept and emptied bins. And I whispered to the photo, not to be heard, but to let it echo through the silence that had once haunted me. "We're just getting started. My name is Liza Eastwood. And this is how I lost everything I thought I needed, only to discover I had everything I was made for." 6 months after Nathan's departure and the official relaunch of Eastwood Noodles, the story wasn't about betrayal anymore. It was about what rose from it. The company had expanded into 3 new markets. Our Spoon and Flame initiative now operated in 5 cities. The Founders Trust had issued over 50 microloans. And for the first time, my father's legacy wasn't just being preserved, it was evolving. Still, there was one thing left unfinished. I stood in front of a plain, undecorated wall in the Fremont headquarters, just outside the executive floor. For years, my father had planned to commission a mural there. Something bold. Something alive. He never got the chance. But I would. I reached out to a young muralist named Amir Nguyen, a Vietnamese-Mexican artist whose work layered street realism with cultural symbolism. I handed him a collection of photos, my father stirring broth in the original kitchen, my first day as COO, a chalkboard menu from 1986, and a snapshot of Javier with the Spoon and Flame students. And then I told him, "I want you to tell the whole story. All of it. Even the fall." He nodded without hesitation. It took 3 weeks. Every day, staff would stop and stare as color bloomed across the concrete, steam rising into a phoenix, bowls turning into constellations, hands reaching for each other across generations. And in the middle, a woman, head held high, walking forward through a storm, holding a notebook in one hand and a ladle in the other. That woman wasn't named. But everyone knew who she was. The day it was unveiled, we hosted a small gathering in the lobby. Employees, donors, students from our culinary programs. I gave a short speech, but I kept it simple. We don't just feed people, I said. We remind them that their stories deserve to be tasted, remembered, and honored. This company isn't about erasing the past. It's about turning pain into purpose. After the event, I lingered by the mural alone. I ran my fingers lightly across a section near the corner where Amir had painted a faded red dress, caught in the wind, half hidden in the shadows. I didn't ask for it. But he understood the symbolism. We don't heal by forgetting. We heal by reclaiming the meaning. And that included even the ugliest parts. That night, I returned to my apartment. Clean. Calm. No more locked drawers. No more secrets. I lit a single candle on the kitchen counter, pulled out my father's recipe notebook, and opened to the final blank page. I began to write, not in his handwriting, not to mimic him, but in my own voice. New recipe, legacy broth. Ingredients: 3 cloves garlic, 1 young ginger root, star anise, hand-cut scallions. A memory worth preserving. And the fire they thought would burn you down, but instead lit the path forward. Directions: simmer slowly. Serve with grace. Never let anyone else write your name on the bowl. I closed the book and smiled. The next morning, a letter arrived in the mail. No return address. Just a plain white envelope. Inside was a single check, $1, accompanied by a typed note. Consider it my final contribution to Eastwood Noodles. I know it doesn't mean anything. But maybe someday, someone will say I gave back a piece of what I took. N. I folded the check in half and placed it in a shadow box next to the red dress and the soup spoon. Artifacts of failure. Proof that I outlived the plan to replace me. Not out of spite, but out of design. Because Nathan never understood what I now knew to my core. You don't inherit legacy. You earn it. And you defend it. Brick by brick, recipe by recipe, betrayal by betrayal, until what remains is something no one can take from you. That afternoon, I walked into our new downtown office for the first time. Rita had decorated it with photos from the early days. A framed quote from my father hung near the front desk. A good bowl of noodles tells you who made it. A great one tells you why. At my desk was a fresh pot of ginger garlic broth, steaming, fragrant, perfect. I tasted it and smiled. It wasn't just delicious. It was home. And as the sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the floor, I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and typed the next big headline for our upcoming campaign. We were never just a restaurant, we were a revolution in a bowl. And this time, no one was going to take credit for it but me. Liza's story isn't just about revenge. It's about reclaiming your identity when others try to write you out of your own story. It's about the quiet power of not breaking, and the strength in choosing legacy over rage. So let me ask you, if someone tried to erase your name from something you built, would you disappear, or would you rise? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Revenge Echoes for more real stories about power, betrayal, and the boldness it takes to rise again.